Alright guys, so for the next 2 or 3 videos, we're going to be talking about the Tokugawa period, and then this series on pre-modern Japanese history from prehistory to 1868 will be completed. And then from there we're going to move on into the next series on modern Japan. So, in 1600, specifically on October 20th, 1600, the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu win the Battle of Sekigahara, and with that, the Sengoku Jidai, this age where the country is basically divided into a massive civil war running over a century, is ended. And in 1603, so a few years after this battle, the Tokugawa clan are declared to be the shoguns officially. So from 1600 to 1868, we enter this period, typically called the Edo period, or the Edo shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate. It's also known as the Era of Great Peace. So this is a period of about 268 years where the Japanese islands are more or less closed off from the outside world, and typically in popular culture. So anime, manga, movies, video games, TV shows, that stuff. The Last Samurai comes to mind here, for example, because it's coming just after this period. When we think about Japan as depicted in pop culture, like all those mediums I kind of just listed, it's one of two periods. It's either the famous Sengoku Jidai, or it's this new period. It's the Edo era. So in order to actually gain control and keep control and allow Japan to develop into this period that we know as the Great Peace, the Tokugawa need to establish a control system that is effective in a way that the control systems of the previous two shogunates basically were not. And so that's basically what we're talking about in this video. So in the aftermath of the Battle of Sekigahara, the Tokugawa, from the defeated daimyo, confiscate 6.22 million koku. Okay, so what is a koku? A koku is a unit of measurement for agricultural productivity, specifically for rice land. So one koku, theoretically, provided you don't gorge and overeat, one koku theoretically would be enough rice to support one person for 1 year. So it takes quite a lot of land to grow one koku. So the fact that the Tokugawa confiscate 6.22 million koku from the defeated lords at Sekigahara means they take a significant amount of land from their defeated enemies. And, following this, like I just said, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu becomes shogun. In 1605, Ieyasu retires and he makes his son shogun. So what he's doing now is he's setting a precedent, basically, to keep the office of shogun in the Tokugawa family. However, there's still a problem. The Toyotomi family technically still has a couple heirs, and between 1614 and 1615, this basically is resolved when the Tokugawa forces lay siege to Osaka Castle, where the Toyotomi were kind of building. Army is maybe too much of a nice word, because it suggests that it's a military formation with a lot of structure. They're gathering a lot of ronins, like masterless samurai, mercenaries, those kind of people to them, in order to try and maybe make a bid for the office of shogun. It doesn't work. In 1615, Osaka is basically destroyed. The Toyotomi are totally removed from power, and the Tokugawa now are really officially in control. So, in the aftermath of all of this, now that they're in control, now that the Toyotomi family is basically fully removed, if I remember right, they're all executed, and combined with the fact that the Tokugawa confiscate 6.22 million koku from the defeated lords at Sekigahara, combined with the 1.35 million taken from the Toyotomi family, the Tokugawa now have basically absolute control over the samurai and the daimyo. And in order to make their system very, very solid, in order to make their system basically last, they take all that land, and they take the defeated daimyo, and they start shuffling people around. So, like we just went over, Tokugawa Ieyasu retires, and he has his son take over. So, what happens now is the precedent is basically set for keeping the office of Shogun in the Tokugawa family. So, in order to actually make this work, in order to ensure that, because the Tokugawa family is quite large, in order to ensure that there's not like a civil war over a succession dispute or something, what is set up basically is this system. So, the Tokugawa family, at the time Ieyasu dies, has 11 sons. So, what basically happens is he sets up, and by he I mean Tokugawa Ieyasu, he sets up a system whereby the firstborn son, so this is on the status of birth, not on status of ability, so it's not like a merit system. The firstborn son of the shogun will basically succeed. All of the other sons, they're watched closely, and the last three, so his three youngest sons, are not allowed to form any kind of a cadet house or anything like that, for the simple reason that he doesn't want it to get too large, just in case somebody gets discontented at some point and tries a rebellion. So the Tokugawa are setting up a very strict measure, or a strict system rather, of succession to the office of shogun. Now, in order to really do this, and in order to really control the daimyo, which we'll talk about in a minute, Tokugawa Ieyasu, when he was in negotiation with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, so this is before Sekigahara, like the 1580s, 90s, like that time period, they work out a set of agreements whereby land is basically transferred. So the Tokugawa give the Toyotomi their like ancestral land in Mikawa province, and the Toyotomi give the Tokugawa all this land out in eastern Japan. And in this new territory that the Tokugawa get, there's this little tiny fishing village, Edo. So Tokugawa Ieyasu, because this little tiny village doesn't really have ties to anybody, it's situated on good land, he makes Edo his capital, and he basically sets up a system whereby, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, the daimyo basically have to stay at Edo. He stays at Edo, many of his family members stay at Edo, so the point is that everybody is concentrated in like this one city. This is eventually what becomes the city of Tokyo. So what he does now by doing this, and this is a long-term process, is that the city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, becomes like the cultural capital, or one of the cultural capitals anyway, of the Tokugawa shogunate. And in the process of making all these daimyo come to Edo, and dividing up his family, and setting all these other different control measures in place, the Tokugawa basically solidify Japanese society. And this was a process that had already been started by varying other, and this was a process that had already been started by some other daimyo in their own estates, in their own lands. They set up Japanese society to basically be hierarchical, both in terms of status and in terms of geographical space. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, the samurai were Japan's military aristocracy, if that's the way we want to think about them in the Sengoku Jidai. They definitely become the military aristocracy in the Tokugawa period. But my point, and this is what the Tokugawa have to deal with initially, is we have this large social group of people who basically are professional warriors. Their aim in life is to study the martial arts. So, after the Toyotomi took control, they issued what's commonly called the sword hunt. This was basically done to disarm the peasants so that, peasant uprisings could not happen. So you have the samurai who are armed, basically keep the lower orders of society, so the poor people, the merchants, etc., in line. But then, you have this question of, well, who watches the watchmen? How do you keep the samurai, this group of people whose sole purpose in life is to be a warrior? How do you keep them from rallying around a daimyo, so a lord, and rising up against the Tokugawa? So going along with that, how do you control the samurai is this question of, well, how do we control the daimyo? And the Tokugawa solution to this basically is to set up what's called the bakuhan system. So this is a combination of the words bakufu, so the central shogunal government, and the Han domains. So I'm going to get into this more in a moment about what exactly a Han is, but for our purposes here, Han is like the new, regional system of estates that are developed. Like I said, we'll talk about this more in a sec. But basically, what happens is the shogunate controls most of the land in central Japan. So they control most of the rice-producing land. So this enables them to not only have, access to the most food collectively, it gives them a very strong centralized position where if anything were to ever happen, they're in the middle of Japan, so they can strike out in any direction. They're not in this is not like the United States of America, for example, where like Washington, D.C. is on the East Coast, and you need a different set of systems to address system on the West Coast. Everything is central in Japan. So it allows effective control to be dished out very quickly and very efficiently. So as part of the way that land was restructured, land is given to the daimyo, and they basically have to stay in their domain for one chunk of the year, and then for another chunk of the year, they have to go live in Edo. So you're controlling the daimyo by keeping an eye on them, and then the daimyo are set up in these castle towns, and the samurai are all based in the castle town. So there's no more samurai landlord, there's no more guy who has the title of samurai, but he's like really poor, so he has to farm his own land. Everybody now serves the role of like an advisor or an official retainer, something like that, to the daimyo, and they're all concentrated in the centralized castle town, in the daimyo's land, or in a city. So power becomes very effectively divided and broken up between the bakufu, which is the center, and the domains, which is more on the periphery. So in order for somebody to actually think about launching a rebellion or an uprising or something, well, it's harder to do now because everybody's so divided, and so much of the resources are concentrated in the bakufu's hands that, yeah, technically you could try, and there are some peasant uprisings, but not any that really seriously threaten the Tokugawa shogunate until the end. But at that point, they have other things they have to worry about, so stuff kind of just compounds. Alright, so I mentioned a few minutes ago that part of the Tokugawa control system was, well, part of the way they did this anyway, was breaking up society based along societal status groups. So, typically, if you read, like, world history textbooks, or you read, like, Western Civ textbooks, etc., you may be familiar with the idea of breaking up society along what we typically call class lines. So, this idea that you have a social class is a very industrial revolution and post-industrial way of understanding how society is structured. You cannot take that idea or that system and apply it to Tokugawa Japan, because Tokugawa Japan is organized along different intellectual lines. So these are status groups, because this is something that grows out of Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism. These are not class lines. It's a different way of structuring and ordering society. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see I've got a bunch of different terms in Japanese, and then I have the characters for how the word actually looks in Japanese. So at the bottom we have tenno. So tenno is, yeah, I mean, technically it translates to like emperor in English. That's not the best translation. We'll talk about this more in the companion series to this about why there's issues with translating it as emperor, but the Tenno is the supreme status. He's at the top of everything. So that's one status group. Then we have the Daimyo. So the Daimyo are like the lords. We have Hane. So Hane are the, I guess, ways that the Tokugawa broke up and divided up land. So these are like large, not really plantations. These are like large agricultural estates. They're kind of like regions or counties. They're that big. A lot of these are designed to be like semi-autonomous. So we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. We have the bakuhan system, which is something I just went over. We have the bakufu and the shogun and the shogunate. So the centralized government of samurai ruled by enforced samurai. We have shimin. So shimin are like the, I mean, technically it means like subject or citizen, as it's sometimes translated into the 20th century. This refers to like the mass of the people. The two words I did not go over are samurai and mibunsei. So mibun is the way that the samurai understood their status group to actually work and the way to actually portray. So the samurai, otherwise known as the bushi, are the warriors of Japan. So the way the status system is set up, there are some really, really specific tweaks and twists to this, which I'm not going to get into here, because there are people that are like part of the system, but like not really. So people that live out in the village or the mountain, sometimes we see them referred to as like the Barakumin. They're technically not part of the system, but they are at the same time. It's confusing. We'll talk about it more in the second series. But for our purposes here, we have 4 orders or 4 social divisions of people. So these 4 social divisions, and this comes from Neo-Confucianism, are the samurai, the peasant, so the farmer, the merchant, and the artisan. And then above and below this, we have different like groups that kind of fit in here in varying ways. So we have the Tenno, or the emperor, the shogunate. So it's a little more complex than this 4 system thing, but just because this is like an introduction series, this is what I want to focus on, is that there are 4 main status groups in Tokugawa Japan: peasants, artisans, merchants, and samurai. Okay, so after the Battle of Sekigahara, I mentioned that the Tokugawa confiscate a crap load of land, specifically agriculturally productive land, from the daimyo, so Japan's lords, and those daimyo are then kind of like reclassified and broken up in order to reinforce the Tokugawa control system. So we have 3 kinds of daimyo in the Tokugawa period. We have the Fudai Daimyo. So the Fudai Daimyo were allied to the Tokugawa, and they fought with the Tokugawa at Sekigahara. The Tozama, this means like outside, so the Tozama Daimyo, obviously, following logic, would be the daimyo or the other lords that fought against the Tokugawa at Sekigahara. So we have these 2 groups, and then we have the Shimpan. So the Shimpan are like cadet Tokugawa houses. So basically, what happens after Sekigahara is the landscape of Japan gets reorganized basically to look like this. So the Tokugawa seize about 25% of all the land. So they control approximately 25 to 30% of all the agriculturally productive land in Japan. So they have the lion's share, really, of the rice production, which gives them the most power. They control the most food. The Fudai Daimyo are granted a significant amount of koku, so rice-producing land. The Tozama Daimyo, Tokugawa Ieyasu has to figure out how to deal with these guys. Because on the one hand, he's like, well, if I divest them of all their land, well, then I sow the seeds of vengeance, and potentially I could have like an uprising. So I don't want to do that. I could let them keep their land. Don't want to do that either, because it makes them powerful. So what he basically does is he takes land from both these guys, both these groups of daimyo, and he reallocates it to them. And he kind of sets Japan up like a checkerboard system where you have not all, but most of the most powerful Tozama Daimyo. So the enemies at Sekigahara, kind of on the outskirts of the Japanese islands, so like the islands closest to China and Korea, those places. These lords have quite a lot of land because he was trying to set up a system whereby he can bind these people in loyalty to them, not piss them off by taking too much of their land, but also ensure they're not like militarily vengeful. And you do that by putting many of the Tozama lords at the ends of Japan and kind of surrounding them with the land of the Fudai Daimyo. So you have like an enemy core area, and then it's kind of surrounded by either water or some impassable landscape feature like a chain of mountains, or it's surrounded by Fudai Daimyo who are ostensibly loyal to the Tokugawa. So that's kind of what's going on with that. Now, the Shinpan Daimyo, succession to the office of Shogun, was based on birth, not merit. So it doesn't matter if the shogunal family doesn't maybe produce a son in one generation. It's not a problem if they don't produce a son, and then the shogun from the immediate family has no one to succeed him, because we have these three cadet branches, the Shinpan, whose job basically was to function as Fudai, so supporting the Tokugawa, but also to provide heirs to the Tokugawa family in case the immediate line didn't have a son every now and again. And this does happen occasionally. They do occasionally bring their own sons into the shogunal throne. So it's along these new lines that the Tokugawa really start to solidify their control over the other daimyo. And they also take control of several of the major cities, so like Nagasaki, Osaka, several key cities. And they also take control over most, not all, but most of the gold and silver mines in Japan, and some of the main road systems across Japan. All technically leading, or supposed to be leading anyway, to their capital of Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Okay, so it looks like now you have something of a handle on the samurai and the daimyo, but now, we have other people in Japan. So it wasn't just daimyo and samurai. We have merchants, we have peasants, or farmers, artisans. What did you do with these guys? Well, the farming villages in the Sengoku Jidai, they were relatively autonomous. This was done for their own protection, but now that Japan's at peace, they don't need this. So the Tokugawa set up a system basically where, well, there's no samurai in the village anymore, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, because they have to go live in the castle town with the daimyo. So the villages are kind of, sort of, autonomous, but like not really, but going along with the whole thing with the status systems. Nobody technically is supposed to leave these status groups. If you're born a merchant, you will remain a merchant. If you're born a samurai, you will remain a samurai. People tweak this a little bit towards the end of the Tokugawa, but for most of this period, if you're born into a status group, that's where you stay. So farmers are bound to villages, and they develop a very collective sense of their own identity and responsibility for order, peace. And this is something that develops out of the Sengoku Jidai with Iki. But these farming villages are organized along hierarchical lines. They have reciprocal obligations. And really what happens in these areas is that you very much develop this system of mutual support and cooperation. So to preserve the family line, adoption is very much a thing that these people did. And they also supported each other a lot with things like charity. People often went to go help each other on various projects. So this might be building stalls. This might be, well, I finished harvesting my rice paddy, I'm going to go help my neighbor. Because the idea is that we're kind of autonomous, but like not really. There's not really a lot of help coming through. If there's a problem, like Tokugawa Japan didn't have like this mass system of welfare that a lot of states have. Welfare existed, systems like that were a thing, but they were very local, because the reason being is that, well, if one of us is screwed, we could potentially all be screwed. So it's in the interest of everybody in the village to basically help each other out and make sure we all survive collectively, because if one of us dies, we could potentially all die. So there's that. So, there's a general way of dealing with the peasants. You tie them to the village. And just as the peasants were tied to the village, well, the samurai and the daimyo were tied to either their own castle towns, which is exactly what it sounds like. We'll talk about this more in future videos. It's a town based around a castle, or cities. So this is a period that sees a growth in urbanization and urbanism, in many ways unlike any other period in Japanese history, and in many ways unlike any other period in world history. So that begs the question, well, why do cities develop so heavily in Tokugawa Japan? There was like 66 major cities by the time this series is going to end in 1868. And the answer is, well, you remove the samurai from the land, so you got to put these warriors somewhere. Well, each domain is allowed a number of cities, but it's only allowed one castle town. So each domain is allowed a castle town where you have a large, imposing castle. So you think about, like, you play Shogun 2, Total War, other video games like that, maybe see in pop culture, like these massive, gigantic Japanese castles. That wasn't really a Sengoku Jidai thing. It comes at the end of the Sengoku Jidai, and really it's more of an Edo period thing. So you have these massive castles in the middle of the city. Maybe there's a moat around it. Maybe there's like a wall or something else. This is where the samurai basically get stationed. This is where they hang out. So what do these people do now? And because Tokugawa Japan brings so much Chinese culture into the country, because they're basing a lot of their stuff on things like Confucianism and Taoism and other Chinese ways of doing things. In Confucianism, there is this idea of the Junzi. So this is like the Confucian gentleman. So what is the Junzi supposed to do? Well, the Confucian gentleman is supposed to understand their status in life. So I am of this status. That means my duties in life are, this, and there's like a list. In order to do this, in order to fulfill these obligations to my society, what I have to do is become a sage. I have to study and learn, because it's through learning that I am able to fulfill these duties. So the Tokugawa shogunate issues this code of instructions and laws for the military houses, meaning the daimyo and the samurai. This is called the Buke Shohato. So the Buke Shohato, basically what it orders the samurai to do is it tells them basically military arts, or the study of like martial arts like the samurai is supposed to do. So sword fighting, archery, horseback riding, spear fighting, unarmed combat, stuff like that. And learning. So, book learning, art, philosophy, writing, rhetoric, all that stuff. These are like two wheels on a cart. If one wheel is broken or of not the right size, meaning you haven't paid enough attention to it, the cart is not going to move. So what the Buke Shohato basically tells samurai to do is to study the martial arts and also study stuff that we would basically consider now to be like academics. With the idea being that we're going to have the Japanese version of the Junzi. We call this the Junsha. So the samurai's role now is to be not a warrior, but to be like a bureaucrat and official. Your job is to become learned, to become wise, so that you can now serve your daimyo, your lord, effectively as a retainer and as an advisor. So in order to do this, if these people are going to devote their lives to study, not only academics, but also martial arts, you can't eat knowledge. These people have to survive somehow. So basically what happens is the samurai make up something like 6% of each domain, along with, servants and tradespeople, everybody else. So each domain now has a castle town of maybe 10 to 15% of its population. Well, many of those people buy their food, but the samurai are given koku stipend, so enough rice to basically last for a year, so that they can, technically speaking, survive, not starve to death, and just devote themselves to learning and to scholarship. So that's how we control the samurai. Now, to control the daimyo, these lords, basically what you do is you say, okay, you have your castle town, your home base, your area. Part of the reason a lot of these surviving castles are so beautiful and so ornate and elegant is because of Tokugawa laws, which basically stated the castle has to be, like, beautiful. It has to be, worthy of having a daimyo live in it. So you can't live in, like, this crappy little thing. It has to be big, it has to be magnificent. But you also have to have another residence in Edo. And technically speaking, although some people get this shifted depending on how far you are from Edo, you have to spend maybe half the year in Edo. So you're required to maintain a lavish residence there as well. Part of your family is supposed to stay there. So you're basically expending all your money on, like, all these different things, with the result being, even if the daimyo wanted to raise an army and revolt, they couldn't because they're all broke. So that's how you control the daimyo. And there are also other cities which don't necessarily go by this, because it's a city, not a castle town. Daimyo don't live there. And there are some other large towns in Edo, basically all of which function as commercial centers, cultural centers. They're necessary for communication and supplying Edo and the rest of the country. So this is a big reason why we see this massive rise in urbanism in Tokugawa, Japan. So these castle towns and cities are centered on what are called Han. So a Han, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, I'm going to get into more detail now. A Han is a unit of land. Basically, to qualify as a Han, you have to have at least 10,000 koku in annual production. So these are big units of land. So when the Tokugawa were dishing out land to the Fudai Daimyo and the Shimpan and the Tozama Daimyo, this is what they're giving them. They're giving them Han in units of 20, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 koku. And the idea is that you're going to surround everybody by everybody, so it doesn't matter if there's, like, an uprising, because everyone's surrounded by people loyal to the Tokugawa. You have to expend all this money, so all these taxes you get on rice, on the housing of the daimyo, of the samurai stipends. Technically, you don't have money, but merchants have money, so you have to, if you need cash, you gotta take it to, like, a broker, and you gotta convert the rice to cash. So this is done with the intention of controlling the daimyo. So at any one time, there's about 260 Han during the Edo period, at least after about 1720. We know, in the beginning anyway, about 540 are in existence, briefly anyway, before it's kind of cut down to 260. So, in order to get anything done in the castle town, in order to use this money you're getting from the Han, you have to have express written permission from the Shogun. So if you have a castle town and you're like, well, it's getting kind of cramped, I want to add another section to it, I want to add another set of walls or something like that, you can't just do that. You have to get express written permission by the Shogun, because if you were to just do it, or even if you do apply to get express written permission, the Shogun might look at this and be like, well, they're expanding the town, which means more fortification. Are they maybe planning an uprising? We don't really know. On top of stuff like that, if a wall breaks, you want to repair that wall in the castle, you gotta get express written permission. And if you screw up, or if you piss off the Shogun in some way, or you start trouble or something, it's entirely possible for the Shogun to basically take your land away and move you someplace else. I know of one instance where that did actually happen. So we know it did. But this was a constant threat that Daimyo had to deal with. So the Han, basically, if you were to plot everything out on a map, made up something like 3/4 or maybe 4/5 of the total Japanese islands. So the stuff that's not part of the Han are still part of Japan, or they're not. So places that we typically think of as being part of Japan now, so like the northern chunk of Hokkaido, the Kuril Islands, the Ryukyu Islands, so like Okinawa is the most famous, not part of Japan at this point. But it's because the Han are so large that most people really, when they thought about like authority, they didn't really think about the shogun. They really did not think about the emperor. They thought about their regional daimyo, their regional lord. So this has kind of two problems, which are going to kind of snowball and lead to a series of issues once the Americans show up in 1853 and we get stuff like the Meiji Restoration, is that throughout the Edo period, there is an idea of a growing sense of like, well, I am Japanese. I speak Japanese, I live in the islands, we have a shared culture, etc. It grows slowly. It's there. But initially, a lot of this stuff, a lot of identities are basically like localized because most people understand the Han, the daimyo, to be their main authority. And the other problem is that, technically speaking, the shogunate issued paper money. Coins, excuse me. They issued coins. But each of the Han had their own paper currency, which wasn't accepted like outside of the Han. So there's multiple currency systems going on here, which is going to be an issue later on when people just start accepting like gold and silver bullion. If there's a problem, like a famine or something, there's not like a centralized response force coming from the government. The Han has to deal with it, and neighboring Han didn't have to necessarily help them. So there are issues with this system. So in the next video, what we're going to talk about is a little bit more about this, system of Tokugawa control, how they united the country and kept it united, foreign relations and domestic politics, stuff like that. But hopefully this video was a useful overview of the Tokugawa control system for you. Like I said, in the next video, we'll keep going with this whole theme. But until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.